Welcome to Black Reading Month 2022. Just want to let you know some of the history. The September's Black Reading Month campaign was founded in 1980 by Malik Yakini, Dave Rambo, Osele Niklele, and Malik Yakini. It was designed to promote the reading of Black books, magazines, newspapers, and journals. Annual Black Reading Month activities included book fairs, writing contests, lectures, and book signings and reading contests. The Black Reading Month committee slogan, "Black reading is crucial for Black survival," speaks to the necessity of being grounded in our own history and culture if we are to survive and thrive in the world. September, when students go back to school, except in the South when they go in August, was chosen as a time to annually reinforce the importance of Black reading to members of our community. It is our hope that a habit will develop in September that carries on throughout the year. In 1985, Gilyard introduced the term "Turn Off the TV" campaign to the annual Black Reading Month observance. Participants in the campaign are asked to go the entire month of September without watching television and to read at least one Black book. Over the past 3 years, Black Reading Month activities have gone online due to the pandemic. Community members are asked to post pictures of Black books that they are reading on the September is Black Reading Month Facebook page. And also for the third year, we are presenting a series of online author talks for Black Reading Month. Welcome to the second author talk for this month's Black Reading Month, for this year's Black Reading Month. This is the format. We will have 45 minutes of conversation with Keith Gilyard, and then we will open for questions and comments around 8 o'clock, and participants will type their questions in the chat. I'd like to give you some background on our guest tonight. He's a prolific author and a very respected scholar, a native of New York and two-time recipient of an American Book Award. Keith Gilyard has passionately embraced African-American expressive culture over the course of his career as a poet, scholar, and educator. Beyond his own literary output, he has pursued and in some instances merged two main lines of humanistic inquiry: literary studies with its concern for beauty and significant form, and rhetorical studies with its emphasis on the effect of trope and argument in culture. Moreover, his interests branch out into popular culture, civic discourse, and educational practices. A critical perspective concerning these areas is, in his view, integral to the development of discerning and productive publics both on and beyond campuses, and therefore crucial to the optimum practice of democracy. As a faculty member at Medgar Evers College in New York, Gilyard helped establish the National Black Writers Conference, now convened biannually at the venue, still at Medgar Evers. He served as the director of the writing program at Syracuse University from 1995 to 99, and as interim chair of the Department of Africana Studies at the same university from 96 to 97. He went from there to Penn State in 1999 and began planning the 7th Penn State Conference on Rhetoric and Composition, which was held in the summer of 2001 around the theme American Ethic Rhetorics. Also long active in national organizations, Gilyard headed the Conference on College Composition and Communication in 2002 and was the Centennial President of the National Council of Teachers of English, 2011 to 12. In addition to producing numerous essays, and I'll tell you, he's been published over 100 times, and lecturing widely, Gilyard has authored, edited, or co-edited 20 books, including the education memoir Voices of the Self, A Study of Language Competence, Let's Flip the Script, an African-American Discourse on Language, Literature, and Learning, Composition in Cornell West, Notes Toward a Deep Democracy, John Oliver Killen's A Life of Black Literary Activism, Truth to the Language Game, African-American Discourse, Cultural Politics and Pedagogy, and Louise Thompson Patterson, A Life of Struggle for Justice. Additional books include the anthology African-American Literature, Rhetoric and Ethnicity, and the poetry collections American 40, 93, Poem Graphics in 2001, as well as the novella The Next Great Old School Conspiracy. And last year, Keith published a brilliant collection of poems called Impressions. And they're good to read by themselves, or to listen to John Coltrane's Impressions first, or to read the poetry while you're listening to John Coltrane. They have similar kinds of effects on you. So without going any further, I'd like to welcome Dr. Keith Gilyard.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. Great to be here. I just recently found out about, your Black Reading Month being in September in Detroit. Another reason Detroit is the blackest city in the U.S. and always has been. So it's glad to be here and part of your program.
Yes, and we're really glad to have you. When Brother Malik Yakini asked me if I knew a couple writers that might be willing to come on the program, I thought of you first because you work so productively, but there's not a lot of fanfare. You just do your work. You produce all this great literature, and it's always interested me, writers and scholars who they just put their head down and go to work. I want to start earlier, though. I want to have you kind of take us through your journey of how you became a writer. And when did that interest in writing and literature start?
Yeah, I'm dealing with that now. I'm working on some fragments of a memoir that might become a memoir one day. I don't know. Depends if I can get the decks cleared, get all the other stuff out the way. But I've been thinking about that lately, and when I think about it, it started very early. I was born in Harlem, and it was just hitting the streets. A lot of it was just the street sounds in the air around me. I just seemed like I just fell in love with certain kinds of language, rhythms of language when I was a kid, like just being almost like, at your mother's skirt, man, just listening up and down 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue, Lenox Avenue, and then listening to the radio. I mentioned it in an earlier piece, but the more I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about the Jocko Henderson show. Jocko was an amazing a radio personality that came out of Philly. Boom, boom, the bop, here comes the jock. I remember that like it was yesterday. So just those rhythms coming off the radio and in the streets of Harlem, just a certain love of language, man. And even when I started school, I sort of gravitated to that rhythmic language early. And once I got my accumulated record from the New York City Board of Education, it's a dreadful document. Got all kind of stuff about me. There's, hard to get along with kids and father not living at home, all this kind of stuff they note on your record. But one thing that was noted when I was in the 5th grade, it said he has tremendous interest in poetry. She has tremendous interest in poetry. And so I was starting to rhyme back then, and writing poems. Langston Hughes, of course, was an early influence. I still remember, when I read that poem about the dark face of the river asked me for a kiss. I was like, wait a minute, man, there's something about that poem. I was about 8, that poem. And I remember I was talking with my friend Tony Bolden once, and he was online, he was asking about people's early experiences with Langston Hughes. And I said, that poem, Suicide. He said, why that poem? I thought it'd be one of the other ones. He said that one, but it was just the metaphor of it, the cool, dark face of the river. You think in one way, it asked me for a kiss. The river asked me for a kiss. It just fascinated my mind. I mean, I was probably weird that way, but yeah, very, very early. And then, of course, you put it to the side because everything else is happening. Baseball, football, the streets, all kinds of other stuff is happening, not really coming back to it. So it really wasn't until my latter teenage years that I started scribbling stuff down, stuff about the war in Vietnam, civil rights movement, that kind of stuff. King got killed, that kind of stuff. And so from there, when I was about 19, they built the Langston Hughes Library 2 blocks from my home. By then I was living in Queens. And so they, that was just like temptation. You couldn't avoid that. It's like 2 blocks, you go to the corner, turn, go 1 block, and then turn the corner, you're at the library. So you had no excuse not to be in there. And so that was my office. People used to look for me. They say, well, Keith, he down in the pool room? Nah, he don't go in there too much anymore. He's in the library. So that's really how it started for me, is the library. And then the writers we used to bring to the library, because they had a reading program. And so, this is in the middle of the Black Arts Movement. And so they're bringing a lot of writers to the library. So you're sitting in the front row, just listening to these people. Jane Cortez, I was listening to Jane Cortez when I was a teenager. She came to the library. Felipe Luciano came to the library, and he wrote a poem about the library that's on the album Right On. I'm not going to say the last line, but I felt that way. I felt that way, the way Felipe felt, I felt about the library. So that was just my laboratory. So that's really how it started. And then the very first piece that I ever wrote, I worked on a community newspaper. And the very first piece that I ever wrote was a newspaper article. A piece that was published was a newspaper article about the Angela Davis trial. So we used to go around the neighborhood just looking for stories. And that was on the news. And so I just wrote about the Angela Davis trial. And that's how I started. And I started writing stories about the neighborhood. I was at the Louis Armstrong funeral because that was one block over from the library. So the Armstrong funeral. So you're covering that stuff as a little cub reporter. And my problem has always been the different genres because I'm in the library reading all the poets. A lot of Detroit, Detroit is big, has big Black literary heritage. You think about Hayden, Toy Derricat, Don L. Lee, who became Akeem Madabuti, grew up in you got Ron Milner out there, the novelist Donald Goines, I'm reading that too, Naomi Long Madgett, though she's not a Detroit native. She spent years there as an adult, on down to today, with Tyem Bajess, Jessica K. Moore and Michael Simanga, so Detroit got the serious heritage, but I was just a reader. I was just in that library reading everything, trying fiction, trying poetry, trying journalism. That's how I started.
It's really interesting you said that about the library because so many writers that I know and have talked to, and including myself, the library played a critical role in becoming a writer. In my case, my mother we were within less than a mile of the library. We used to walk there every week, get books, and we had to read them and take them back when we walked back the next week. And so as a kid, it became a little bit, it wasn't a shame, but it was just like, oh man, we're in the middle of this ball game and stuff. In the summertime, she'd be like, all right, it's time to come in for lunch and an hour of reading. But it developed a lifelong habit, that reading. What did you feel that first time you saw something you wrote in print?
Man, I can't even remember. Like 50-something years ago. Like 50 plus years ago, but I felt good, Right. We had a community newspaper because we used to work, we had a workshop and there were two reporters. One was Al Harvin, who covered the riots, and he made his bones covering the riots in Watts back in '65. And by then he was working for the New York Times as a sports writer. And he used to come out on Saturdays and do a journalism workshop for us. So that's how we got into journalism. And they said, if you come to the workshop on Saturday morning, you get $5. I said, well, shoot, I'm down with that, So we got the $5. So we were just all into this community newspaper called the Transition Press. And so when I had the first piece come out, felt great, like you were a real writer, and people thought I worked in the library. I never got a dime from the library. They thought I worked there because I was there all the time. I had my little table. That was my table pretty much. And they said, yeah, they thought I never worked there. I was just there all the time. So, and then we formed a group. We had a poetry group called the Colonized Few, and we met and operated out of the library. So yeah, library was big, and my mother was a reader. She always was reading something. Sometimes like romance magazines and stuff like that, but she was always reading something. And I used to go in her room when she wasn't home, and I used to I don't want people to get all Freudian with this kind of stuff, but I used to go in the room and lay on her bed and get her little magazines out the little place where she kept them. And I used to read those real corny love stories, but she was a reader, always had some kind of book, a novel, a story and stuff like that. And so I remember when I did the book on John Oliver Killings, and she called me up. She said, hey, you should get Pulitzer Prize for this book. She said, I read it in one night, So she was always a reader. So she was a model, even though she wasn't reading like Sonia Sanchez's poetry and stuff like that, but she was always reading. So she was a model, so that was it.
I actually agree with her about that John Oliver Killard's book. You should have read it before. That's an amazing book. So where did you go to college and when did you go?
I stayed, when I got out of high school, I stayed in New York. I didn't go to college that September, that fall, because I had done some things that had sort of taken me out of college for a minute. I had actually was supposed to, I was ticketed, put it this way, I was ticketed to go to Notre Dame. And then the guards interceded, which was good because I had no business trying to go out to South Bend, Indiana at the age of 18, where my head was at that time. So anyway, they took the decision out of my hands because they canceled my scholarship in the summer. So I didn't go anywhere in the fall. So I stayed in New York and I went to a community college, Queensborough Community College. And I went there for 2 years and then I transferred to Queens College. And so I went there. So I stayed right home in New York.
When you first entered college,
back there, college and the college cost $43 a semester when I was at Queensborough. And then I transferred to Queens, and they charged us $67 for a student fee, and I was pissed at that. I was like, man, we pay $43, we got to pay $67. And so I think about that when I think about how they've saddled all these kids with this debt these days. That's why I went to school. Then from there, I went to,
back to that.
Yeah.
When you went to college, what were you planning to do?
I was thinking lawyer. I was thinking lawyer at that time. One of my mentors was a brother named Ramon Jimenez. We called him the people's lawyer in New York City. So he was from my neighborhood. Matter of fact, he lived directly across the street from Malcolm X. He lived on 97th Street, right across from Malcolm X. And at the time that I started really hanging with him, he used to take me down to the 8th Street bookshop because they was in the books, right? So we go to 8th Street bookshop, get all those books and whatnot. And so at that time, he was finishing up at St. John's University, and he was about to go to Harvard Law School. And he was the only Puerto Rican at Harvard Law School. He was there at the same time as Patricia Williams. Matter of fact, I remember seeing her up at Harvard when I used to go visit Ramon. So he was a mentor. And so he used to bring me up to, I used to go up. Sometimes I go on the train. I would go on the train and visit him in Harvard and stay in the dorm. And sometimes I would ride with a mutual friend of ours. There was a friend of ours named Sonny, and he used to drive. He had this Carmen Gee, and he used to drive like 85 miles an hour. And we'd be hitting it up from New York to Boston and all that. And we got caught out on, there was the big protest against the war. And we were out on Boston Commons, and Ramon was giving this speech about how white liberals would cop out, when the action got heavy. And they got upset, and they were drinking out on Boston Commons, and they started throwing bottles up on the stage where we were. And I was like, Ramon, we got to get out of here. He said, man, I got to finish my speech, man. That's the type of guy he was. But he was the guy that later served a subpoena against Mayor Koch, and he was responsible for keeping, largely responsible for keeping Ostos Community College open in the Bronx. He left Queens and settled in the Bronx, and that's where he got the name, the people's lawyer. They loved him. So Ramon. So under Ramon's influence, he'd have me in the library researching stuff. I still remember res judicata. Res judicata has something to do with double jeopardy. And I spent all day in the library researching this for him. And then that's when I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer. I said, I ain't doing all this stuff all the time. So, and then he wanted to be a writer. So I would write some poems and show them to him, and he would steal them. And he would put Spanish words in them, and he would go up to the Bronx and read them to the Puerto Ricans and say that he wrote these poems, and so that was my brother, I didn't care. That's how we used to do it. So I was thinking lawyer, and then I started thinking more about the writing more seriously about that. Yeah.
As you thought about the writing, did you get people saying to you, what are you going to do with an English degree?
I don't think anybody cared. So I really didn't get, you gotta remember, you and I and some other people like us, we from the age, a lot of us are first generation and stuff like that. So the kind of pressure kids get now is like, if you're going to college, you better go to engineering school or be a doctor or something like that. I think you get the middle class pressure to do that, but I don't think anybody really cared about what I was doing. Glad I was doing something. So
Right.
yeah, I didn't have any pressure like that. Yeah, I don't think, yeah, the more I think about it, I don't remember getting a lot of queries like that. I know that's usual and I hear it, with other folks, but not so much.
Yeah.
They figured I would, they figured I would teach, end up teaching, maybe you'd end up teaching somewhere or something like that. And that was
So
cool.
let's talk about that for a minute, because your bachelor's in English, right? And then what are your other degrees in?
Oh, well, I went to Columbia. I went MFA program, same program. Shortly, a few years after, I didn't know him at the time, but a few years after Willie Cagistelli had gone to Columbia's MFA program, I went in. And then when I left, I think I was the last Black person that was in there for a decade. I don't think they let anybody else in there for a while. They really didn't know what to do. I was studying fiction because I had submitted a poetry portfolio. They didn't know what to do with it. They said, we can't even evaluate this. So I said, well, I go into the fiction, because George Davis had he wrote the novel Coming Home. He was running a workshop for the community, and I attended it on a non-credit basis. I wasn't matriculated then. I was in George Davis's workshop, who he had taken over from John Oliver Killens, who used to run a community workshop at Columbia. So John had gone to Howard by then. So I was in George Davis's workshop. And from there, I applied and gained admission, part because of George's recommendation. I gained admission into the MFA program. So I was really studying fiction up there, studying fiction, trying to write a novel, stuff like that. So the poetry, I figured I'd learn that in the library. The people all those books that were on the shelves in the library, those were my poetry teachers, from Robert Hayden on down. So that's how that went.
So what was next for you after that? How did you get into the academy as a teacher, and both in your creative writer, but you also are a scholar in rhetoric and linguistic culture?
Yeah, well, how that happened is I left New York, after some things happened in the mid-'70s. I left New York, went to Atlanta. I stayed, actually, the thing that happened was my very best friend, not a mentor, but my day one, he died. And so it was just something about the time and the city and all that stuff that was just a lot for me. So I was in Atlanta for a little spell. And then again, thinking that, coming out of Columbia with MFA, I didn't realize how that whole game worked, is that I said, well, I got an MFA, I'll get a job teaching creative writing. They don't want you to teach creative writing anyway. That was about, you didn't need an MFA to teach creative writing, because they're giving the jobs to the published authors with reputations and stuff like that, So I really didn't quite understand how all that worked, but still I was glad I did it, because everything I learned, everything was food. So everything I learned and everything I practiced, I was able to use later, even if it wasn't in the genre of fiction. You was able to use those techniques, dialogue, how to move a scene, stuff like that. So it was all good. But then I started thinking, yeah, you got to think about something. The writing is cool. I think the average salary for a writer in America is about $4,800 a year, something like that. So I said, you need to be above that average. And so by that time, the City University had gone to open admissions. And so the City University was not a lot of it because of protest activity of writers like Luis Reyes Rivera up at City College, and Sekou Sundiata, a phenomenal poet, up at City. They were student activists, and so they were part of what of the impetus for how City University became open admissions. And so the community, the university was diversifying. Of course, they started stigmatizing, the minoritized, so-called minoritized students. They started stigmatizing them, and then there was a whole basic writing, or a whole remedial writing industry that sprung up. And so there were opportunities there to get into tutoring and teaching. So I was tutoring at a couple of the units, York College out in Jamaica, LaGuardia Community College down in Long Island City by the bridge. And then eventually I saw a job notice. I went to a conference over at Medgar Evers College in Brooklyn and saw that they were advertising for a position, visiting. temporary. But I applied for that and I ended up with that position. That's a long story, but I ended up with that position, and then the temporary turned into 14 years, and so that's how I got into academia.
Okay, and let's shift now to your books and research and stuff. Do you have a favorite? Sometimes people say, "Do you have a favorite baby?" Right? So, do you have a favorite book that you've written?
Nah, it's always the next one.
Mm-hmm.
I know for me, it's funny. It's a funny feeling. Like, once you write them and they're done, they kind of recede into the past further and further, like the end of, like the end of Gatsby and that green light, they just start fading further and further away. So it's always like the one you're working on. That's the one you're most excited about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm in the middle of this, how can I get through this? And same way with individual piece, like a poem or whatever, the one you're working on, that's the one you care about the most. That's kind of that's the way it is with me. So,
do you go back and read your work?
I do.
Mm-hmm.
I do. I know a lot of people lie and say they don't, but I think they do too. I do. Sometimes I read it a lot. Sometimes, Michael, you get a certain age, you got to read it to remember what you said. Like if it's prose, you got to remember what the argument was. I said, man, I remember arguing something like that. What exactly? Now, how did I argue it? What sources did I cite? What did I use? So yeah, sometimes you got to refresh the memory. So I do. I go back and read it. Yeah.
Yeah, I asked that because you're right. A lot of us don't read. I read the poems, but the fiction, I don't read it.
Right.
After I published it. I see too many mistakes.
Yeah, well, you're going to see that. Yeah, that
so I don't want to see it.
Yeah. I read that really fast. I go like real fast. I don't really, I like with a fiction piece, I don't really sit down and go over it like you're reading a book anew. I kind of just like zip through it,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What made you do the John Oliver Killings book?
One of the things that happened, I worked with John for 6 years. He was our writer in residence at Medgar Evers. And in fact, the same year that I joined the faculty, which was 1981, that was the year he joined the faculty. So I knew him then. And it was interesting because I had read his novel, The Cotillion. I read that when I was a teenager in the library, right? So I said, man, this name is familiar, man, John Oliver Killings, and then The Cotillion. Then I didn't remember the novel that well. And then when I started hearing people talk about it, I said, man, I read that book, so I read that book about Yoruba and the Lovejoy family and stuff. So it was great to have him around. And then the more I talked to John and the more I studied his career, I was wondering why this was a guy. I was talking in class about this the other day. This was the guy that was on the A-list of African-American writers. I mean, when John published a novel in the early 60s, he'd be on the Today Show.
Right.
And stuff like that. He was at Baldwin level. It's like Killings, Baldwin, he was at that level. And then decades later, he's not on the radar. He's not even on the Black radar. And if you look at something like the Norton Anthology of African-American Literature, he ain't even included. I said, well, how's a guy that wrote like 13, 14 books and was considered one of the architects of the Black arts movement, a father? Addison Gale called him the spiritual father of a generation of Black novelists. Tony Case and celebrated him as breaking from the right protest tradition, and ushering in a new era in the African-American novel. You can't really study the development of the African-American novel in the 20th century unless you go through Killings. And I said, well, how did that happen? And then I realized how it happened. The more I studied and read, that when you have his kind of political sentiments and commitments to what he wouldn't allow people to do with his work, then you saw what happened. He got the reputation of being intractable, hard to work with. He had a chance to have The Cotillion was being adapted for Broadway. And, Smokey Robinson and Willie Hutch were going to do the music, and so the music was going to be nice and all that. And John had satirized folks out on Long Island, and the people putting up the money said, well, you write about Black people with such tenderness and whatnot, but when you write about these other characters, man, you just really go in. And he said, so what? And so they said, yeah, so what? But you can't do it without money.
Right.
And so if he compromises, he's on Broadway. and maybe we know about them. Same thing happened with regard to the silver screen. They were going to make. Matter of fact, Variety magazine had announced the beginning of the production of and then we heard the thunder. This war novel, and yeah, they announced it in the magazine and whatnot, but that fell apart again because of they wanted to change, elements of the novel and whatnot. He said no. So those reasons, and that he fell out of favor. That doesn't really explain why he's not in the Norton. You got to ask Skip Gates about that. That don't explain why he's not in the Norton, but he should be. But it seems like most people, if they have leftist commitments, they have a hard time making that Norton.
Yeah, I'm always amazed when a new edition comes out of who's not in there.
Yeah.
And how was that choice made? When you were doing the book, I remember you came down here for a considerable amount of time to Atlanta to do your research.
Yeah, the archives at Emory. Yeah.
What was that like?
The archives for the Killings archives at Emory and the Louise Thompson Patterson archives at Emory. So I like libraries. I really got tested about how much I like a library because I spent days and days and days.
I know.
I used to go to library. I used to go to Emory Library when they opened up. I think they opened at 8:30 or 8 or something like that. I'd be there when they opened, and I'd stay till they closed at 5. So yeah, it was just, you just get into the work, man. And once you jump to the archives, the time goes by so fast. You look up, it's going on 5. You say, like, what's been going on? I've been, but you've been reading this stuff all day. But you're delving into other worlds, other lives. You're getting information, a lot of information that you see, that you read, and then you find out the information is wrong. So, and then a lot of fun. You start reading personal letters. So and so is writing to so and so, and this one, and people that you read about, but you didn't know they had this correspondence going back and forth. So, no, it was a lot. I was glad to see you down there, but it was a lot of work, but it was worth it.
That we're going to get coming because so much is transferred digitally. So the idea of handwritten letters and handwritten manuscripts.
Yeah, I worry about that. That's a big loss. And I think about that too, even when I'm emailing people, I'm saying, you should save this email. But by the time you think you should save it, you already sent it, deleted it and stuff like that. But all those files of correspondence that we used to have, a lot of that's going to be lost. Unless people printing out and saving emails and all that kind of stuff, or just saving them. Yeah.
So yes, I agree with that. I wanted to ask you about how you feel about today's language, because you're a language person. I love the beginning of this conversation when you were talking about the sounds of the street and stuff, and that you begin to see language as more than just what somebody was speaking, but it's all these different parts of life that have a specific and unique language. What do you think about the future of Black literature, given the context and content of language today?
It's hard to say. I'm always optimistic about the future. That's just personality thing. But I just think that, like in all times, you have artists take what's around them. They take the materials that are around them and they craft something, and they have a chance to craft something that's beautiful. That doesn't mean that all that's around is beautiful, but they can see the beauty in it, and that's what art is, right? Trying to give material significant form. And having some sense of beauty. So I look at it that way, like not everything I hear when I walk around the streets in New York, when I'm walking around Queens and I'm uptown and stuff, not everything I hear do I think is great language, but I think that there will be someone with an ear for the best in that who will be able to craft that into something, So that's the way I think. It's kind of, it's not really an elite position, but it's sort of like a high-low. I sort of have like a high-low perspective that there's always going to be the common denominator. But there will always be artists who fashion something out of that least common denominator. They would fashion something. They would fashion something that we could call art. So I'm optimistic that those people will always come along. So I'm supporting the young artists and whatnot. They always come along and manage to do that.
Yeah, I have faith in it too, in belief that it's happening. I think one of the things that they don't have the benefit of is what was in the air when we were coming up. The Black Arts movement, and the Black Power movement, and the mentorship of really great writers.
Right.
I mean, they didn't ask for money. If they saw that you had something in you, they would, say, okay, you need to come by here and talk to me.
Definitely. I was having this conversation with a friend of mine the other day. He's starting to teach a history course in high school in Bed-Stuy. And I was saying, man, these kids are lucky, man, that they got you. I said, we didn't have somebody like you. And then he mentioned some people that were around, like J2, Weusi and people like that who were in Brooklyn when we were young. I said, yeah, but they were young, and I thought about it later. I said, yeah, they were young. They weren't in their 60s.
No.
They weren't in their 60s like you are now with all that repository of wisdom and all that kind of stuff. We didn't have access to that. But like you said, when we did meet people, they took an interest in you. When I was sitting in the library. Yeah, when I was sitting in the library, there was this guy. He used to stare at me all the time, and I used to say, "Man, why this older dude? He's staring at me all the time, man." You see, I'm going back. I'm reading all them books coming out of Broadside Press, so it ain't taking long. Books like 26 pages, 24 pages, 32 pages. So I'm knocking them out. I'm reading, going, getting another book and stuff, and he'd be sitting there staring. He'd be staring at me from across the library, and then I found out he would have a sketch pad. Like he'd be sketching something, right? So I found out later that was Elton Fax, the very renowned artist. And then one day he struck up a conversation with me. Then he started telling me stuff and asking me about stuff and mentioning artists. I didn't know any of that stuff, and he started teaching me about the art and the artists and the tradition, the visual arts tradition and stuff like that. So yeah. And he always had time for that. It's like he come in the library, like he'd be looking for me then. It's like, where's that young fella? So I could, he just wanted to tell me everything, and so it was like that. But they're missing that because a lot of times these people are not in the neighborhood. I live 3 blocks from Louis Armstrong. Armstrong used to throw barbecues in the backyard, man. You're like, Mr. Armstrong is home when he's in town, He's traveling a lot, but when he's home, man, he might throw one of them parties in the backyard. You need to get on down there, And so I actually worked with his wife later, Lucille, after he passed away. But we put on a Louis Armstrong memorial concert in what was then the Singer Bowl, what was later renamed Louis Armstrong Stadium, which was later renamed National Tennis Center at Louis Armstrong Stadium, which is crazy to me. It's like they minimized the Armstrong name and the whole thing. But yeah, you can see that in the neighborhood. There were a lot of, you think about, we had like 5 of the greatest trumpeters in the world right in the neighborhood. Armstrong, Clark Terry.
Didn't Dizzy Gillespie live up there?
Dizzy lived around the corner from Louis Armstrong. You can look out the back of Dizzy's house into Louis Armstrong's backyard. I mean, so Dizzy was out there. Clark Terry was out there. Roy Eldridge lived in the neighborhood. I mean, those are just trumpeters. Then you had other musicians. Cannonball lived a few blocks away from me. So Nat Adderley too. And it's just like that. Jimmy Heath.
That's a very interesting point because in the same way that we were just talking about the mentorship of older artists, more mature artists, that to have those artists, world famous artists, live in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Detroit had similar experience because the Motown artists lived in the neighborhoods.
Right.
You're gonna be riding down the street and somebody be waving at you. I saw Marvin Gaye. My father and I were having lunch on the east side. You read that?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite essays of yours. Yeah, absolutely.
And wasn't no cell phones. You can record that stuff for nothing. But he just walked in. The people said, "Hey, Marvin," he went and sat down at the piano, start playing. And when he finished, he just got up and walked out the joint about an hour later, and nobody ever, and it was just like he had the need at that moment to play music, you know, to hear music.
And yeah, we had that access. I remember I was at the library once. Billy Taylor was giving a lecture, and I asked him a question about Roy Eldridge. He said, "Why are you asking me? Why don't you go down the block and ask him? I didn't even know he lived down there." He said, "He right down the block. Go ask him." You know. Right. So, and then once I was working with this part of what I did after college. I was working with a neighborhood organization, a drug rehabilitation organization. Then we also had a cultural component. And Ed Bullins came out one day. He was driving this Toyota station wagon, and he had this camera equipment, you know, loaded in the back. And he was like, yeah, he said, we should just go around and film some stuff. And I was like, this is Ed Bullins, you know, it's like, but he said, come on, man. He said, what you want to do? So I just started naming stuff. I said, let's go look at this, and let's go. We just went around, and he just went filming stuff. And it just so happens that I had heard that Bobby Seale was giving a talk out at Queensborough Community College, my alma mater. And Ed said, Bobby's speaking out there. He said, Bobby used to be one of my students. He was in my acting class when I was in San Francisco. He said, let's go out there and film him. So we went out. I went out with Ed Bullins. We went out and filmed the Bobby Seale talk, you know, stuff like that. So that's the cultural stuff that would go on, you know, in the neighborhood like that. But I wish kids had more access to that now.
Yeah, I'm not sure this generation now and the next generation, they have that kind of access, you know. Right. Ron Milner, he had plays produced on Broadway, and he would come and perform plays on a street corner. And in the basement of a church, and, you know, at a recreation center. He never had a thing that, okay, I'm this big Broadway, you know, writer. Right. When he wasn't directing the play on Broadway, he was back home in Detroit and always engaged in the community, you know, teaching in schools and just whatever he could do. And it was kind of an ethos of the Black arts movement. You know, this is the people's artists and the people.
Bring the art to the people, no doubt. Yeah. Matter of fact, you weren't even legitimate unless you could move the people in some kind of way. So they were like, it was like being in the Apollo or something, you know. It's like every time out, you better earn that applause and whatnot, you know. Got that right. You gotta connect with the folks, yeah.
And when you think about those people at that level, like you were talking about Jane Cortez, who I have always believed is an underrated or undervalued or underpublished poet of the Black arts movement. Amazing poet.
Oh yeah, one of my idols, yeah.
Yeah, but they were also very committed to the development of the art. I remember almost every major poet or writer that I talked to, they always told me, you know, you have to be committed to this.
Right.
And, you know, you show them something and they say, oh yeah, that's okay, but it ain't good.
Yeah, it's all right.
Right. You need to go back and do some more work on that.
And mainly do some more reading. You know, it's
absolutely.
Like, yeah, you got to read, man. You have
absolutely.
Yeah, I never understood writers that say, well, I don't want to read because I don't want to be influenced by this or that. You need to be.
Yeah.
You'll filter it out and make your own thing out of it, but you have to read.
Oh yeah, you have to. And I think that's one of the things that I see in your work always is this deep research that you do and thinking about it, but you have your own voice, so you're not afraid. You're not afraid that if you read somebody else, your voice will be obscured. And I think that's part of the issue for some of these developing and younger artists is the need to read is not just for information.
Right.
You know? Keith, I know you've had this experience when you've been reading a book and it was the language was so profound, you had to put the book down.
Right. You got
Toni Morrison is a perfect example for that.
Yeah. You know? Or even if sometimes the language is really that rapturous, but even when it's not, sometimes it's just a technique.
Yes.
Like if you're trying to figure out, like if I'm reading a novel by Chester Himes or something like that, and it's like, well, he turned the page. Wait a minute, I turned the page and now he's downtown. I said, how did he get from over here to downtown? I need to know how to do that because that ain't easy to do. You just have him like 5 minutes later, he's walking into over here. Because you would say, if I'm gonna leave this room, I got to go through that door, down those steps, through another door, into the street. I got to make a decision, go right or left, turn at the corner, go down to the side. I ain't got time to write all that. When you see that in his book, he says, well, 5 minutes later, he was walking through the door of the so-and-so. I said, oh, you can just move it like that. So sometimes it's the beauty of the language, yes, but also the technique.
Yes.
How to move the story and stuff like that. You stop. I just stop and say, wow, how you do that, And
The greatest personal experience for me was when I was writing In the Shadow of the Sun. And I write, and then the next day when I come back to write, I edit what I wrote the night before so I can get back into the rhythm, right? Not heavy editing, but I just start there. And then I would be reading stuff and I would think, did I write this? When I did my dissertation, I felt the same way, man. I had to go back and make sure I wasn't plagiarizing.
But it'll come out of you, man. And you put it, you put it in there. Like Langston said, theme for English B, right? Put it in you and let it come out of you. Then it will be true,
Yes.
So yeah, that's it. You read, you gotta stay committed to it though. The discipline is the hard part. Like the hard part for me, I think one of the biggest challenges was this multi-genre thing going. I knew like my heart was always in poetry. And one of the things I thought about is like, you need to always try to write yourself back to that. Because I was always trying to clear the decks to get back to that. But, I never even planned on an academic career or anything like that. But once you did that, like I say, it's not destructive writing, so it's creative also. It just takes a lot of time and stuff. And so I just never thought that I would do all of that academic work. And you're gonna something has to give. You can't, you can't really do it all the way you want. So you're sacrificing one thing for the other. And I feel that probably for me, that poetry got sacrificed along the way a bit. So I was glad to do the book. Last year. But when you think about it, for my age, I could have a lot more poems than that. But then I did all this other stuff. So
maybe this is the poetic era for you.
Yeah, we'll see.
Awesome, man. I hope that the people who are on this webinar that they will buy it. It is an awesome collection of poetry.
Thank you.
I'm gonna tell the audience a little secret about writers, and this is I was working with Keith on his book, and we would be finished, and then Keith would call me and say, wait a minute, I'm not finished yet. I saw something in that poem that I need to fix.
Yeah. I was a pain in the behind. I wasn't reading well enough, and then I would just read again and see something else, So yeah, Michael had a lot of patience there. Thank you for that. It was very patient.
Yeah, and musicians are the same way. They're like write something and start, and it's like they hear that something different, and it can go on forever. I think all artists are like that to a degree. At some point, this painting is done.
You got to snatch it out of their hands. Right. You never finish the book. You just publish it.
Right.
If they hand you Shadow of the Sun back, you're gonna go to work on it.
Yeah, and that's
So you gotta let it.
That's go. Why I don't read it, because I'll be like, oh man.
Yeah.
But I think that the idea of what art is, the discussion of, during the time when we were coming up, there was always a discussion of art. I was telling my students recently that political events always had artist participation. So, it wasn't like you would go someplace just to see art and someplace to hear politics. They always blended.
Right.
Although there were places where you would go to poetry readings and jam sessions and things like that. But I don't think the same connection exists in terms of the depth of the understanding of society.
What
do you think?
I think they're still connected. I just think the dominant politics are different. Generationally, I think they, when you think about the hyper consumerism and turbo capitalism and whatnot, and I think that artists that are very connected to that.
Yeah.
And that's what they're down with, right? So
Oh yeah.
I think they understand pushing that ethos in their art,
Hmm.
get paid, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's an art politics connection. I just think it's different politics.
Hmm.
It's not the politics of revolutionary Black nationalism, put it that
Right.
way. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Want to open this up to the participants to ask questions. And do I do that? Or I think that the great tech people who are running this are going to do it. Is that correct? Because Keith,
Yes.
we could be talking a long time.
Right. Yeah. Bring them in.
Okay. If you're an attendee and you would like to ask a question, you simply need to raise your hand and I will move you onto screen so that you can ask the question. So there is a question in the Q&A and I'll read that, or Dr. Simanga, you can read that if you'd like.
Let me see. Where is it? It's in the chat, right?
It's actually, if you look in your toolbar, there's something that says Q&A, and then you click on that, and then there's a question in there, but we have an attendee who's raising their hand. So I'm gonna allow Ali to talk. So we'll take that, and then you can do the question in the Q&A.
Okay, great.
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. This is Mike Leslie. How you doing, man?
Hey, Michael. Good to see you.
Yeah. So I'm working on a memoir, and one of the things I'm trying to figure out is focus. Like, you don't want to. I understand you don't start from. I was born in 1950 all the way up till now. And how do you focus? And I know there's a theme, and I have an outline developed and stuff. But can you talk about focusing, or just that getting the stories that some stories don't work, but it's all in my head, and can you talk about that?
Yeah. You want me to jump on that?
Yes, Keith.
Yeah, I think one of the things you said is part of the problem. Is like all of the stories in your head. Yeah, I think the first thing you got to do is get it out of your head. There's no writing but writing, right? So walking around thinking about what you're going to do, might do, could do, that's not writing. Writing is only when you actually write. And so what some scholars have called shaping at the point of utterance. Sometimes, like Flannery O'Connor said, sometimes I don't even know what I'm gonna write until I see what I say. You see, so when you get into it and you have some material, then you can make decisions about, what, I spent some time crafting that episode, but you know what, now that I'm moving along, I don't even need that episode.
Okay.
That episode doesn't really fit into an evolving conception of the work, you see. But if all you're doing is thinking about, like, I don't know exactly how to shape it and where it's going to go, and I don't know how to frame it or start it or whatever, then that's to me, that's where you're going to be for a while. I think you should just be writing. Things get cut out of long stuff all the time. You write and write, and then you cut some out and say, okay, this is not going to go in. And remember, we got those missing chapters from Malcolm's autobiography. Was locked up in a Detroit lawyer's office for a long time, right? So I mean, and you can see it when you read the memoir. You're like, Malcolm, you was over there in Mecca, then you came back, and it seemed like something missing, but I didn't know when I read it when I was young. I didn't realize it was something missing. Then when you got older, you found out, you said, oh, they took some chapters out. They didn't even publish it, So you make those decisions about the shaping of it, I think, as you go along. What are the final effect? Like, what do you want this memoir to do? Because you're correct. You can't do it all. Like, unless you have, think about it, unless you have electronic equipment and somebody actually films you coming out of the birth canal and follows you every moment of your life, everything you telling is a reduction. Right? You don't have all that scenery from 1950 to now. You ain't got all that. And that might necessarily have the audio, and it doesn't have the internal thoughts. So there's no way in the world anyone has ever written an autobiography, let's say, that covers everything. That's not even possible.
Mm-mm.
And a memoir, less so, because I make a distinction between autobiography and memoir. But yeah, I would say write, scribble, write, scribble, write, and it doesn't even have to unfold linearly.
Okay.
Most of the time, I don't even work linearly. You know, it could be this scene, that scene. Something comes to mind, jump on it while it comes to mind. Say, yo, I was thinking about this thing, this episode. This thing here was funny. Let me write this down. I don't know what page that's going. That might be on page 140. Who knows? But sketch it out, flesh it out, write it down. Let's see if it fits in later. To me, it's more like putting a puzzle together. You know, writing to me is like them old cameras where you take them instamatic pictures and then you watch them. The picture emerges, and you know, like that. It's not like a train coming out of a tunnel. Right. I don't write like that. It's more like that snapshot that's emerging that way. So I think about the text that way. When you think about it as this big canvas that you're just playing on and moving pieces around and getting to it, which you can do so much better now with a word processor. I imagine people in the old days writing, man, going through all the multiple drafts. We can just move you can just move stuff around now. You know, I'm gonna move it off that page and put it over here. I'm gonna move that paragraph over here and switch that, do that with the touch of a button. So that's what I would say on that. Just get to it.
Okay.
Do it, write it, sketch it, and collect sketches. Somebody said, man, you got all them pages, man. He said, yeah, you know, these are my sketches. I'm gonna hook it all up. It's gonna come all right. It's gonna be all right in the end. But I'm just, this is my process. I'm working on it. Yeah,
I've got short stories I've written in the past that got published, and in fact, I'm starting to read that stuff now, and some of it's horrible.
Join the club.
So,
yeah, that's what you learn, right?
Yeah.
Michael, I think the other thing about it is, every writer has their own process, and you'll figure out what yours is. We always have a lot of ideas in our head. And that's why I think when Keith said, you got to get out of your head, because, you'll be sitting staring at the wall until you fall over with all these ideas. For me, it's like the ideas are pushing each other back and forth. And the one that elbows to the front of my brain, that's the one I start writing.
Okay.
And it may not have anything connected to anything else. I had no idea I was going to write a novel. I had the first line in a dream. Woke up, had a pad next to my bed, wrote it down. Next day, I went and put it in the computer, and a year later, I had a novel.
Wow.
But I had no idea what it was going to be, what it was going to say. You have to let the story, even in a memoir, it's still a story.
Right.
And you have to let that story drive you, let it speak instead of trying to make it speak.
Okay.
I've had ideas change genres. Like I've had something that started out as a story. I said, this ain't no story. You make a poem out of this, and vice versa. Right. I have a poem and said, man, this ain't no poem. You got to write this out as a story, So, but it's all in the doing, Yep. To me, is you shape it. You shape as you go along, because you don't. It's like you're dealing with students sometimes, and I say, man, you get that paper together. It's due in 2 days, and they say, oh, don't worry about it, Professor. I got it all up here. I just got to write it down. I said, okay, go ahead and do it. And then when they sit down, it's like, oh, it ain't all up here. You think it's all up here. That's an old illusion, right? It's not up there. It's not there till you. It's not there till you're putting it down. So that's why I always say, writing is writing. And
thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
And thank you for writing.
Keep at it.
Keith, Michael and I grew up together along with Malik Yakini. We were all young activists in Detroit's high schools.
Cool.
Yeah.
And Michael had a long career as a union organizer in the factory. So
he's seen a whole lot.
Yeah.
Still got the scars. They still hurt.
That's all right. The writing's gonna help with that.
Yeah.
That's right. That's the bomb. Okay, who's next?
We have some questions in the Q&A, so I'll just read the questions and then we can go from there.
Great.
So we have a question from Tabia, and she says, found the word trope in one of the write-ups about you and fell down a rabbit hole reading about that word. Please say more about it and how it manifests in Black writing. And I'm not sure if I pronounced the word correctly, so I will spell it T-R-O-P-E.
Trope, yeah. Trope. Is a word that comes. We find that in the classical Western canon. Actually, it's a figure of speech or a pattern. You think of it as a pattern or a theme or a repetition. So I was just talking about this in class the other day. In other words, Moses is a trope in Black writing, right? If you look at the spirituals, for example, the spirituals are a trope in Black writing because what you see is those themes repeated over and over again in the work. For example, if you look at a novel that I read when I was young, A Different Drummer by William Melvin Kelly, there's a fictional state. It's east of Mississippi, but west of Alabama. So it doesn't exist because there's no space in between those two states for another state. But what happens in the course of that novel is that it's the only state in the United States which has no Black residents by the end of the novel because they all exited. They were all exodusters, right? By the end of the novel, they all left, sort of like the Israelites moving out of Egypt. And so you have that. When you look at people writing killings, for example, there's a scene in Youngblood where they had the kids doing the spirituals, and they said, well, we'll explain the real import of the spirituals about how when Blacks were down there in Egypt land, like Egypt land being the South, under the evil Pharaoh, the slave master, the overseer. So it's just a pattern and it repeats, and those patterns repeat over and over again. So that's how it relates to Black writing, is that you see those things repeat. For example, if you look at, I've written about this, if you look at the beginning of a novel like Native Son, for example, the first sound in Native Son is an alarm clock, goes off like 6, 7 in the morning. And the first human sound you hear is the mother's voice, a domineering voice telling Bigger, get up, Bigger, blah, blah, blah. This is on the south side of Chicago. This is, in the late 1930s, 1940. And then we fast forward to a young playwright out of Chicago who sets a play 16 years after Native Son. She makes her protagonist exactly 16 years older than Bigger Thomas. And the play starts with the ringing of an alarm clock. That's the first sound in A Raisin in the Sun. And the first voice you hear in A Raisin in the Sun is the wife, is Walter Lee's wife, yelling at him to get up, get ready for work, so on. So Lorraine Hansberry is repeating the opening of Native Son. That's what it means. So she's troping. That's one way to say it, is that she's troping Native Son in A Raisin in the Sun, you see. So I don't know if that's explaining it or making it more complicated or making the rabbit hole worse, but I would just say that to make it simple, it's patterns, and it's how patterns play out. How patterns play out. You can see how patterns play out in Black writing if you move from writer to writer. And writers write back to other writers, and art speaks back to art.
Great, thank you. Great explanation. The next question we have is, who are some young writers that we should be paying attention to?
Applies in the music.
They didn't say specifically, it was just who are some young writers that we should be paying attention to.
I wonder why they always ask the old people that question. That's the one question I'm going to flub, right? It's like the young folks got to tell you, they got to tell us who we should be paying attention to. I mean, I read, and because for me, a young writer could be somebody 50 or 45, and they say, I ain't talking about them. I'm talking about the real new writers on the scene, emerging on the scene. So I don't know. I just know one of my favorites is Jesmyn Ward. I don't know how young you want to call her to be, but I just think she's a devastating novelist, period. And I teach her work. But see, to me, those are young writers. Like young writers are like Holson Whitehead. These are middle-aged people now, but to me, they're young. So I don't know, if you're talking about who are the 25-year-olds we need to pay attention to and stuff like that, I really don't have a good answer for that. Unless it's in music,
So that is.
I like Kendrick Lamar, stuff like that. But, other than that, I'm not expert on the young writers. I have to admit that.
Okay. So let's transition because there's another question that involves music. Are there any hip hop lyricists who should be seriously considered to be upholding the best in the Black literary tradition?
Oh, Kendrick is one of them. I just said Kendrick, but there are probably several. Again, these are not. I mean, I was teaching again because we were looking at these religious themes in the literature, and I was teaching students Lauryn Hill. The Final Hour. I was teaching that the other day, and the students was like, "Whoa, look at this, man! Look, I mean, these lines. like keep your dean true, observe what a queen do." They was like, "What? She wrote this back in the day." So. I think in the tradition of Lauryn, you got writers, you got, like I say, Kendrick and others out there coming along. I'm upholding, to me, if you got verbal virtuosity and what you're saying is somewhat positive, you in that tradition. But I can't name them all. They're not coming out of drill rap. I know that. It's not the drillers. It's not the drillers that are doing it. I know that might get me in some hot water, but yeah, I'm thinking, I don't, again, you're asking, it's hard to ask the 7-year-olds to tell you about what the 20-year-olds are doing, when they haven't even read us yet, right, Michael? so yeah.
Okay. Another question. What is the distinction between an autobiography and a memoir?
To me, the way I think about that is it's the contract between the writer and the reader. Like when you call something an autobiography, they're subjecting it to a certain truth test. Like they're taking everything you say is the truth and this is what happened and so on and so forth. Even though we know, like Virginia Woolf said, autobiography is my favorite form of fiction. But there's a contract. There's a contract with the reader where they think they're reading truth. That's why, what was the guy that was on Oprah with the little miracles, the guy that claimed, they claim to have been through all these experiences with drug rehabilitation and all that, found out that he falsified all that, and everybody's mad at him, because they thought that their contract had been violated. We read this as truth, and we put a certain amount of emotional energy in this as truth, and we find out that you made the whole thing up, So autobiography to me is a stricter truth standard. Memoir, when I think of memoir, I think about someone telling a story about the times they were in which they happen to be a character, and so it's not the same truth test. It's like if Michael and I are driving around the city and we get stopped, Michael could be driving and we get stopped by the police or something like that. And the memoir, I might say, when I was driving down the street, I got stopped by the police, It's not literally true, but you don't expect it to be because it's true to the times. You see, so for me, the memoir is more about you being sort of a character in the times, and the times being sort of more important, in a sense, being more important than your personal experience, your personal narrative of it. And the autobiography is more focused on you as telling your story, and it's all true, even though we know it ain't all true, but it's all true. There's a difference. So I'm saying there's a difference in the contract between the writer and the reader, and what the reader's expectations are. To me, that's what distinguishes those genres.
So I have a question now. Can you explain more as to the contracts you make in your writing? Because as you explain the autobiography and the difference between an autobiography and a memoir, what kind of contracts do you consciously make when you're writing, and how should others kind of move into that?
Yeah, I'm not that much of a do that type person when it comes to telling writers, what they should do. But for me, for example, as I said earlier, I'm in the beginning stages and playing around, don't even know if I'm writing this memoir. But one of the things I know about this memoir, I ain't gonna tell everybody everything about me. I already know that ain't happening, and so it's like, you skipped over this, you skipped over that. Tell us about this. No, I'm not getting into, there are some things I'm not talking about. That's what I mean by a contract. So I don't want you to pick this up and say everything that like, here's the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You're not getting that from me. You're going to get a reflection. Like Michael asked a question. How did you start as a writer? Like, I don't know. I don't really know. I got an idea. These are the ideas in my head. I remember being in the street, listening to the music, stuff like that. So that's what I'm going to write. I'm going to say, we listened to the Jocko Show when I was a kid and this, that, and the other. So that's the stuff I'm going to put together. Did that really happen like that? We don't know. It's happening like that in my narrative, but is that really happening like that? I don't know. And I'm not worried about it. That's what I'm saying. That's a contract I'm making with myself. I'm not trying to tell you the absolute truth that you could have captured with a camera or a tape recorder or something like that. That's not the contract I'm making between me and the reader. My contract is, I want to give you some sense of the journey, as Michael started. What's been that journey through the arts or through politics or whatever? I want to give you some sense of that, like me in those times with those things that went on, So that's what I'm writing about. And so it's like, yeah, but when you rode around with Ed Bullins, what diner did you go to and what did you order for lunch? Ain't none of your business. You see what I'm saying? That's what you're not going to get. So that's what I mean. You make up your mind about the things, the narrative, the kind of narrative you're going to spin, and then the reader comes to understand that, And so you get around, you get around these other arguments that you have, like you see, again, to go back to Malcolm's book, when we talk about when he went to Mecca and did the transformation and realized they were white-skinned Muslims, and he came back and it changed his perspective. I said, that's a really great story, Malcolm. You lived in New York City. You could have picked up the phone book, and any day of the week, you could have seen all those Arab names in the phone book and the white-skinned Muslims walking around New York City. But you needed a narrative that accounts for your transformation. So it becomes the trip to Mecca that accounts for that. And I like it. I like it as a memoir, but as an autobiography, I ain't swallowing that. Come on.
Okay, we have a couple of other questions, and we have about 9 more minutes. I'm going to say both of these questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Please say more of the influence of jazz musicians on the rhythm and melody in your writing. And the second question is, can Michael introduce himself?
Yeah, let Michael introduce himself. Give Michael more love.
So these are some of my myths. I'm like, Keith, you're not gonna get everything. I grew up in Detroit, went to Mumford High School, was engaged in the Black student movement. In fact, one of the scholars who works with Keith, Dara Harper, is that a last name, Keith? Walker, Dara Walker.
Dara Walker.
Yeah, she did her dissertation on Detroit high school movements in the 60s and interviewed a bunch of us, including Malik and some other people who were active during that time. But like Keith, I was drawn to words and poems very early in life. And of all the things that I like to write, that's probably, what gives me the most satisfaction is writing a poem. I have a doctorate in Africana Studies, came to it late, like Michael Leslie. I worked in a factory for a while. I was in the Black Power and Black Arts movement. As much out of my head as I can, because the time is getting shorter. What Keith was just talking about is that, at one point you have all this life in front of you that you can see way down the road. That's not true anymore. So, just trying to be productive. For those of you all who know about the African-centered education movement in Detroit, my mother and her closest friend were founders of the Aisha Shule and the W.B. Du Bois Academy, and mentored people like my friend Malik, who went on and started his own school in Saroma. So it's a lot of connections. Last thing I'll say is people say, where are you from? and I say I'm from Detroit, but I live in Atlanta. And I've been here 40 years, and I still say I'm from Detroit. You know, it's like you say I'm from New York, right, Keith?
Right.
So thank you for asking, though.
And good. What was the other question? Was about jazz?
The other question, and I'll read it again. It says, please say more of the influence of jazz musicians on the rhythm and melody in your writing.
Jazz is everything to me. You know, especially in poetry. You know, not all poetry is what I would call jazz poetry, but sometimes it really is in my head. The rhythms of that. I remember I did a reading once with Kalamo Yasalam, and we went out to eat after the reading, and he was explaining there was another poet that was reading with us, and he said, "Yeah, Keith does modals. He's like modal jazz." I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." You know, I hadn't studied that yet, but Kalamo had, and he said, "Oh, this is what you're doing." You know, connected to jazz. So it's just in me. You know, I mean, I used to DJ when I was in college. I had a jazz show on the air, and so. It's always it's just in me, you know, that's just in me. That's just in my sensibility. It's like when I heard Lee Morgan playing at the beginning of the intro before we came on the air, I was like, oh, Sidewinder, that's my thing. You know? So no, it's just, it comes up, you know, we don't see it, you know, when I don't see it, what was the sister? She wrote the novel, Bebop Rebop. She is one of Zam Wilson Cartier. And she was one of the people that actually, I was impressed by that novel because she was trying to really like have jazz rhythms in fiction and like on the page. So I thought that was an impressive attempt. Haven't heard much about her in recent years. But yeah, jazz is just in me. It's just, you know, I don't know how Michael feels about it, but it's just in there. It's like the vitamins, man, that's it.
Nice. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Michael, and then we can wrap up.
First of all, Keith, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I think it's important that particularly the younger generations or all of the generations below us and you are an exemplar in that regard. So just thank you. I hope that you all will use this seminar as an opportunity to buy Keith's books. And I say that because, you know, writers got to eat too. And we're not going to eat much from sales, though.
Right. Not too much. Yeah.
But I hope that you will buy his books and also read more from him. There's a lot of stuff on the internet about his work and the work that he does that you all will share with other people. But I want to thank the participants for, you know, logging on and continuing in the tradition of Black Reading Month, and hope that you all will be advocates for getting people to participate next year and for the rest of this month. We have 2 more weeks of writers coming to talk.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Malik Yakini and the Black Reading Month crew, for sponsoring this and inviting me to participate. Very grateful and always willing to do something for the Detroit Black community. Make sure you're here next week, same time, right? 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. What time do we start? 7 o'clock, right? See, that's another feature of getting old.
And I'm older than you. So.
Yes, but thank you all. Thank you all for coming.